Moncion.
Senator Moncion.
Alors, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable colleagues.
To speak on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation at the second reading of Bill C-13, an act for the substantive equality of Canada's official languages. In speaking to this bill, I must, above all, acknowledge that the official languages are also a symbol of colonialism for Indigenous peoples in Canada. Besides the issue of territory, the predominant use of English and French has been at the expense of Indigenous languages and much more. Having grown in a minority community as a Francophone, I acutely understand the role of language in identity construction and in understanding and preserving a people's collective memory. It is important to remember that Indigenous languages are also part of the rich linguistic, cultural, and identity tapestry of our beautiful and great country. We must recognize this facet of our history and take an interest in those languages and their vitality. Bien évidemment,
of course, the domination of English has also been to the detriment of Francophonie in Canada. Let's be honest, a reform of the Official Languages Act is both necessary and urgent. For decades, there has been a steady decline in the demographic weight of the Francophone minority, based on mother tongue, language used in the home, and first official language spoken. We must act now to reverse this trend, which threatens the growth and development of our communities. I'd like to begin by saying that I support Bill C-13 and its adoption as soon as possible. However, I believe it is important to point out the elements that are missing from this bill. My speech will take a rather critical look at this legislative proposal. Given the importance of the language rights of Francophones in minority situations and the 50-year wait for a substantial reform of the Official Languages Act. It was at Confederation in 1867 that the Constitution Act first recognized the use of English and French in Parliament and before the federal courts. In 1969, the first Federal Official Languages Act was passed. The breakthrough at the time was its Section 9, which required federal government departments and agencies to ensure that the public can communicate with and obtain services from them in both official languages. The language rights of Canadians were further strengthened when the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was entrenched in the Constitution in 1982. The Official Languages Act was then revised in 1988, declaring the government's commitment to enhance the vitality of official language minority communities and support their development. Which brings us to today, May 2023, with the arrival of Bill C-13 in the Senate. As the Italian poet and philosopher Giacomo Leopardi said, patience is the most heroic of virtues, precisely because it has no appearance of heroism whatsoever. So close to the finish line, this quote highlights the heroes who have been working behind the scenes of this reform project for several years in order to present the Government of Canada with a thoughtful and restorative redesign proposal. I'm thinking in particular of all the individuals and organizations that have been advocating for Francophones in minority situations and who have been catalysts for its modernization.
Nations of Canadians who aspire to become bilingual or to have their children to do so. As an officially bilingual country, Canada should establish a legislative framework that allows for substantive equality of rights holders, but also for equal access to language immersion and learning of the other official language. Canada must provide itself with the means to achieve its ambitions. Despite all these legislative developments, juxtaposed with developments in the courts, from the Société des Acadiens case to the Beaulac case, the demographic weight of Francophones has declined over the years, and as the use of French in Canada. The portion of people outside Quebec whose first spoken language is French has decreased from 6.6% in 1971 to 3.9% in 2011. In its current form, Bill C-13 is the result of hard work by French language minority communities and could possibly reverse this trend. However, this bill also has significant shortcomings. À la lumière de l'étude
Based on the pre-OLO study and several testimonies, I've identified the elements that I believe are most important, but which are absent from the version of C-13 we just received from the other place. I congratulate Senator Cormier, by the way, for the excellent presentation you gave on the whole evolution of Bill C-13. If you've ever been involved in the discussions on the reform of the Official Languages Act, you will surely have heard the main demand of stakeholders that Treasury Board be given the responsibility to coordinate and ensure the implementation of the Official Languages Act. That was one of the OLO Committee's recommendations in its report entitled Modernizing the Official Languages Act, the Perspective of Federal Institutions and Recommendations. In Minister Joly's white paper, which is the source of C-13, it's explained that in terms of official languages, and I quote, accountability is fragmented into multiple processes and reports, and is not always done in a timely manner. We are also told, and I quote, the Treasury Board already has significant powers, but the use of these powers has diminished over time. The government then commits to, and I quote, strengthening and expanding the Treasury Board's powers, including the power to oversee compliance with Part 7 of the Act and to assigning the strategic role of horizontal coordination to a single department. Clearly, C-13 is incongruous in that it requires Treasury Board to exercise this role for only certain sections of Part 7 and parts of Part 5 and 6. Including positive measures and bilateral agreements. Clearly, C-13 is incongruous. Because it requires Treasury Board to exercise this role for only certain sections of Part 7, contrary to the government's intention as expressed in the white paper. I'd like to see when the time comes to review the legislation whether it would be more appropriate to extend these obligations to all of Part 7. It seems inconsistent to me that the government, the House of Commons, the official languages committees in both places agree on this, but that C-13 would restrict the scope of Treasury Board's powers in this way. Nevertheless, the bill and its amendments concerning the central agency respond in part to the concerns of organizations representing OLMC interests by the official language minority communities' interests by expanding the powers of Treasury Board and replacing its discretionary powers with obligations. After years of haphazard and partial implementation, this will strengthen oversight and accountability for official languages across the Government of Canada. On the other hand, another inconsistency was present in C-13, as Canadian Heritage was given a lead role in its implementation. The Lang Committee corrected this by giving Treasury Board the responsibility of taking the lead role within the federal government on the implementation of the legislation. I welcome this correction from the other place. Although the Lang Committee, from the other place, adopted an amendment to encourage the inclusion of language clauses in agreements with the provinces and territories, the provisions on bilateral agreements are not binding, and the minimum content of language clauses is not defined. The language used is so weak that I really question whether the inclusion of this provision will yield any results. Yet, the federal government's legal obligations with respect to official languages do not end with transfers to the provinces and territories. Too often, official language minority communities do not have access to the funds to which they are entitled to flourish and develop. This is a systemic issue at all levels in our communities, from early childhood to community to post-secondary. In the absence of provisions in C-13 that make the language clauses enforceable, we will need to exercise oversight and vigilance over the implementation of these provisions as an objective chamber of sober second thought. The federal government's spending power must respect its official languages obligations. Sometimes, These are even constitutional rights when it comes to rights holders, in accordance with Section 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This links to my third point. Access to complete data on elementary and secondary school attendance is essential, since this access is subject to a numerical criterion. The term "where numbers warrant" means that parents and school boards must be able to justify their claim to minority school facilities by demonstrating to the provinces and territories that a sufficient number of children are entitled to them under Section 23 of the Charter. The provisions of C-13 concerning the enumeration of eligible children are not broad nor binding enough. In particular, the Fédération nationale des conseils scolaires francophones is requesting that the bill include a commitment by the federal government to periodically count children under Section 23 of the Charter. An amendment was submitted to Lang, the committee of the other place, to require enumeration as opposed to estimating the number of children of entitled persons under Section 41.4 of the Official Languages Act. However, a sub-amendment changed the text to read, "The federal government shall periodically estimate using the necessary tools the number of children," end of quote, greatly weakening the force of the proposed amendment. The official who appeared before the committee explained the two alternatives as follows. Counting is really counting. If we really want to count, we need the support of other tools that exist in provinces and territories. Estimating? We can do that. Just do it at the federal level. It's a snapshot in time. If it's count, we really need to confirm with lists of provinces, with provincial lists that have access to school boards, that have the exact numbers in a timely manner. I find it difficult to understand how the division of power stands in the way of creating an obligation to count children who are entitled to an education in the official language of the minority. The promotion of and respect for official languages minority rights is a federal responsibility. In particular, the government has a duty to advance the equality of status and use of the official languages under subsection 16.3 of the Charter. I hope that we will vigorously pursue the issue of enumeration at the Senate Standing Committee of Official Languages.
Scolaire francophone demande aussi que la loi sur les langues officielles oblige les institutions fédérales à tenir compte des besoins du réseau scolaire des ayants droit dans le cadre du processus d'aliénation des biens immobiliers fédéraux. Un amendement adopté par la Chambre des communes prévoit que les ministères et institutions fédérales devront consulter les communautés minoritaires et tenir compte de leurs besoins et priorités dans le cadre d'une stratégie d'aliénation. Nous devrons étudier la...
We must study the content of these amendments. Canada's Supreme Court, in the Conseil scolaire francophone de la Colombie-Britannique versus British Columbia, ruled that rights holders must receive an educational experience that is substantively equivalent to what is offered at a nearby majority language schools, including provisions in Bill C-13 concerning the disposal of federal real property, could prevent similar cases, all in the name of achieving substantive equality between the majority and minority communities of a given province or territory. This situation recurs too often in our communities. I must also highlight the good work of C-13. Francophone immigration is one of the determining factors in the demographic weight of Francophones in Canada. Immigration is also one of the areas of jurisdiction where the federal government can act and exert a significant influence on the composition of newcomers. Although there has been a target of 4.4% for Francophone immigration for nearly 20 years, it's outdated because it does not allow for the maintenance of the demographic weight of Francophones in Canada. The government recently reached the target, but it was a first. It's clear that we need much more than a simple Francophone immigration policy. Elected officials in the other place have understood this issue and its importance for the vitality of our communities and the French fact in Canada. As a first step in the right direction, the bill sets out the obligation for Canada to adopt a Francophone immigration policy that will contain objectives, targets, and indicators to increase immigration to Francophone minority communities. In order to improve this provision, the Official Languages Committee of the other place unanimously adopted an amendment which provides that the federal government recognize the importance of Francophone immigration by ensuring the restoration and increase of the demographic weight of Francophone minorities, thus suggesting an obligation of result. In terms of Francophone immigration, the mandate given to Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada in C-13 is finally clear, precise and binding. The public service must operationalize a change in culture that promises to be promising for the future of our communities.
It's very important for official languages minority communities, oui. Si on veut bien me l'accorder.
If leave is granted, is leave granted? Thank you very much, dear colleagues.
Accélérer.
I'll speed up.
Very important for official languages minority communities because of the Official Languages Act in some way counterbalance and decentralizes federal system for implementing language rights in a minority context. As a proud Franco-Ontarian who grew up in a province that has long and often trampled on the language rights of its French-speaking minority, from Regulation 17 to the threat of abolishing the Université de l'Ontario Français and the Hospital Montfort, to name but a few linguistic crises, I'm aware of the importance of the federal language rights regime in representing the interests of people from an official languages minority community in Canada. In most provinces and territories, other than Quebec, there is no legal protection for French. New Brunswick is the exception, being the only official language province, and in some way the province of Ontario as well, with its French Language Services Act. Consequently, official federal bilingualism has long been a guarantor of the rights of French-speaking minorities in Canada. The implementation of the Official Languages Act directly affects respect for the language rights of Francophones in minority communities.
Notable advances in Bill C-13 include the recognition of French as a minority language in Canada and North America due to the predominant use of English, the expansion and strengthening of powers of the Treasury Board as the central agency responsible for implementing much of the legislation, the clarification of positive measures, and the requirement for Immigration and Refugee and Citizenship Canada to adopt a Francophone immigration policy. Several of the amendments passed in the Other Places Official Languages Committee strengthen the proposed legislative framework. Your OLO committee is the author of a report on the modernization of the Act, which inspired the various reform proposals to the Official Languages Act. In order for us to begin our review work as soon as possible, I ask you to refer Bill C-13 to OLO as soon as possible. Thank you for your attention.